New year, new skills, IBM Security Basics. Today we're going to talk about the basics of IBM Security and where to get started in this new year. We all start the new year with the best of intentions. We're going to talk today about the things that you can look at on your IBM to get started with security. IBM relies on three pillars for the security of the system. Each is crucial to ensure a strong system. System values control the global security settings. User profiles grant specific users special authorities and access to certain processes. And lastly, the individual object authorities manage access to specific items like libraries, directories, files, and programs. Overlooking any of these can leave your system vulnerable. An example of a bank security system. The system values set that overall security policy. The user profiles allow cashiers to access their work areas and object authorities, then protect that sensitive data like customer accounts that only certain users should have access to. Ignoring any part of those could compromise the security of the system. When we talk about system values, we're talking about how to control your system's security and setting the overall tone for how your system will behave. Everything from how users can sign on, the integrity checking of the system, how the system itself checks authorities, and communications and how secure those communications are. The Q security system value is the first place to look to see what the tone of your security posture is on your system. The security levels range from 10 to 50. 40 is the most common secure operating level out there. When we talk about levels 30 and 20, there are still systems out there running at level 30 and 20. And those do pose integrity challenges for securing your system because of the way they're set. At level 20, a user profile, when it's created, defaults to have all object and save sys special authorities. All object is that authority that grants you access as a user to all of the objects on the system. At level 30, that's no longer the case. User profiles are definitely more secure, but there are some ways that you can access the IBM programs directly rather than going through the approved APIs that can allow vulnerabilities to be exploited. The shipping value is going to be level 40. It used to be level 30. And we still see a lot of customers moving from level 20 to level 40. And there are a lot of ways to do that. But be mindful that at level 20 or at level 30, you can still secure your system without having to compromise certain configurations of user profiles or of programs just by monitoring your audit journal. There were some changes at v7.r5, so I talked about how at level 20 you would create a user profile and you'd automatically get all object. Well, even past that, before version 7.5, user profiles by default were created and they were created with a default password, meaning that password is the same as the user profile. IBM is continuing to take steps to make the system more secure right out of the box. And one of these steps was to remove that default value now from the create user profile command and set that default value to none. So now you have to set a password for those new profiles being created in your ecosystem. The IFS home directory, even if you didn't have authority to that home directory, you would be able to traverse that tree and be able to see the contents within home. That has been changed. So now you have to have explicit authority to be able to do that. There are systems, believe it or not, still out there at security level 10 and have been migrated from hardware to hardware to hardware and upgraded from OS to OS. But now at OS level v7r5, security level 10 will no longer allow for a profile that does not exist to be created at the sign-on screen. And level 20, now at v7r5, will no longer be able to be set. So if you have a system and you start at level 40 and you want to back down to level 20, that's no longer allowed. So taking these things into account, getting your system to a more secure security level will be advantageous, especially with new OS versions coming on. Another system value that sets the tone for your system is the create authority value. Create authority sets the public authority for all objects being created on the system. Now, there are certain overrides that can be taken into account where a library can have its own create authority. So objects within that library may be created with a different public authority than all the other objects on the system. A great way to start evaluating this is to break down your libraries into certain categories of IBM libraries, vendor libraries, application libraries, and possibly query or user libraries that are out there. If we look at how that public authority is set, when we create a new object, there is an attribute parameter that's called auth. It defaults to lib create auth. So it's going to look at your library first. So if we look at the library and we look at the create authority on that library and it's set to *sysval, we know now that the objects being created in that library are going to go off of the system value, and that generally defaults to *change in a new system build. That means that every new object being created on your system is going to be set with public having change authority to that object. More integrity checking happens at levels 40 and 50. And there are other values that even at levels 20 and 30 you can set to ensure integrity of programs being restored to your system are at the highest level. So the verify object restore, the force conversion at restore, and the allow object restore system values all work together. So the allow object restore sets the tone for what programs can be restored to your system. Allow PTF and allow program adopt are going to allow you to install those PTF programs signed by IBM that are system state programs to be restored. Allow program adopt are going to be allowing programs that have it configured for them to adopt the owner's authority to be restored. The value of 3 for each of those other values is going to ensure that if there is a signature on an object, that the signature is valid. And if the objects have been tampered with, they are going to be reconverted to their original compiled version. When we start talking about users, so we've gotten through our integrity of our system, we've talked about how we validate that and we strengthen those checks to make sure that what we have is what we need. When we look at our users, the first place to start is your passwords. If you're still using passwords, making sure that those passwords are strong and have not been compromised is important. So level 1 and level 3 that I've highlighted on the slide are talking about the fact that they've gotten rid of a weakly encrypted version of the password that exists at either level 0 or level 2. Now at v7r5, they introduced a new password level 4. This applies the same rules and complexity that levels 2 and level 3 do. So you can still have up to 128 characters. It's case sensitive. And the biggest thing that happens is it gets rid of the 0, 1, 2, and 3 versions of the password when you move to password level 4, so that those more weakly encrypted versions of the hash, because the IBMI doesn't actually store the password, those weaker encrypted hashes are actually removed completely from the system when you go to password level 4. The biggest consideration when you're doing a password level change is that you do have to do an IPL, because that's when that conversion happens for the passwords. The other piece is any of those profiles, any of those services you have reaching into your system that have hard-coded passwords, those will now be case sensitive if you're moving, especially from 0 and 1 to 2 or 3. And once they become case sensitive, you need to make sure you know either how to change those passwords, so the day after the change you can update them, or even being able to update them prior to the change, ensuring that you have what that password is. So if there is a mismatch and an invalid sign-on, you can correct it quickly. When we talk about the complexities of passwords, using the password rules rather than the password values allows you to take advantage of some really nice shortcuts to be able to require complex passwords, and also ensure that no one can bypass these complexity rules. So the recommendations that I've placed on the slide of require any 3, a minimum length of 12. The 2 values I want you to pay attention to today is the all create change and the limit profile name. The all create change special value ensures that even a user with all object and SecAdmin authority will not be able to set a password that does not meet your criteria. So it will have to be a minimum of 12 characters, and it'll have to have an upper, lower, a special character, and a digit. 3 of those 4 will have to be within the password. And that limit profile name special value, that ensures that no part of the username can be contained within the passphrase. Another way that we can help ensure that our users are the users signing onto our systems, and that it's not someone that has possibly acquired credentials that aren't theirs, is setting the QMAX sign-on and the QMAX sign-on action values. So QMAX sign-on, we recommend 3 to 5 invalid sign-on attempts, and at that threshold, ensuring that that max sign-on action is either set to 2 or 3. So you're at least, with option 2, disabling that profile after the invalid sign-on attempt. If you set it to 3, you'll also disable the device they were attempting to sign on with. Now, this was really valuable when named devices were really common. Named devices aren't as common anymore. Most systems out there that I've observed lately are using virtual devices. So disabling that virtual device, a new virtual device will likely just be created behind it. So disabling that profile is really the most important piece. The other step you can take is limiting the device sessions or the interactive 5250 emulation sessions that a user can be signed on to simultaneously. By setting that limit device session either at the system level, so 1 or 2, so by default, all users would only be able to sign on to 2 green screen sessions at a time. And you can override this at the user level. So if you have administrators or you have certain users that need more than 2 sign-on sessions at a time, you can override that at the user profile. But the recommendation would be set that limit device session to 1 or 2, because how often in your operations do people really need to have more than 1 sign-on session at a time? So if their credentials have been compromised, anyone trying to sign on while they're already authenticated and already working will automatically be rejected. So let's talk a little bit about that connectivity and making sure that we're using secure communications for that connectivity. Encrypting the traffic over the wire is super important, because anyone that has a sniffer on your wire, and whether you think they do or not, most of the threats we find are coming from inside. So having that data encrypted over the wire is really important, even internally. At v7r4 and v7r5, the default values for protocols is TLS 1.2 and TLS 1.3. TLS 1.3 was back leveled to be available at v7r3, but the defaults at v7r3 is SSL v3, TLS 1.0, and TLS 1.1. So you will have to manually introduce TLS 1.2 or 1.3 into those environments if you're on an older OS. Now, to go along with these protocols, you also have the Cipher suites. Now, the Cipher suites have two options that control them on the system values. You've got the list control, which is going to say whether it's being set by the system or it's being user-defined, where you have either reordered the ciphers that are in the list or you've added additional ciphers. And then the cipher list itself. And that cipher list and the order that you have those ciphers is important. That cipher list will determine what order those ciphers are evaluated in to make that communication complete and have the transmission encrypted using the strongest algorithm. So it won't search that whole list to find the strongest. It expects that the first match that it finds, that both the requester and the target both have in common, is going to be the strongest algorithm. So make sure that that list of ciphers is in the strongest to the weakest order every time, especially if you've set that to user-defined. So let's get into object authorities a little bit. And this is one of the more fun places, I think, because there's so many options and so many ways to ensure your system is secured and that users only have access to what they should have access to. So we've really got 4 different ways that we can access objects through authority. So there's public authority, and that is an authority that is assigned to every object. It could also be regarded as a private authority. We have private authorities, which are generally the individual user profiles or group profiles that have been granted authority or been excluded from having authority on objects. You have the special authority of all object that is assigned at a user profile individually, and that, regardless of what the public authority is or the private authorities are, that all object authority will grant access to all objects. And then there's adoptive authority, and that is a programmatic way of allowing temporary elevation of a process or of a user to be able to access objects that they wouldn't have access to either through public, private, or having the special authority of all object. So a neat way to be able to look at these authorities when you're looking at an object is there's some shortcuts that IBM has introduced, and that's the all, change, use, and exclude shortcuts. Each of those actually represent object and data authorities, very specifically assigned. So all grants you all. So you get all of the object authorities and all of the data authorities. When we look at change and use, you can see that they both get object operation under object authorities, but they don't have any of the other object authorities, meaning they can't delete the objects. They aren't going to be able to alter them. But they do receive different data authorities. Change still has all data authorities, meaning you can add records, you can read all the records, you can delete the records, you can run the program. And use has only read and execute, meaning that if it's a program, you can execute that program. And if it's a file, you can only read it. You can't add records to it. You aren't going to be able to change, update, or delete records. And if it's been set to exclude, that means you are lacking any of the authorities. So if we go and do a deep dive into these, when we look at object authorities, they allow you to work with the object themselves. The data authorities let you work inside the object. So now we're talking about files. and being able to adjust records and change things. And exclude is denying you any access to that object at all. When we look at the object authorities and what each individual one does, they have very specific purposes. And you can reduce these authorities down even further from just the shortcuts that I introduced at the beginning of all, change, use, and exclude. You can set these specifically to ensure that only the access required to that object is being granted. There is a special authority on authorization lists, and that's the authorization list management. And that also has been enhanced with how it is handled at v7r5. And I do recommend you taking a look at that because it could change how some of your processes may work at v7r5. And when we look at data authorities, these are a little bit more straightforward, where you're going to be able to read a file, you're going to be able to add records, you're going to be able to update, you're going to be able to delete, or you're going to be able to run a program. And lastly, I want to talk about the all object special authority, where even though it's not an object authority and it is set at the user profile, it does affect what access a user has to each and every object on your system. You can equivocate all object special authority to root authority on a Unix system. Another option for accessing objects is through adoptive authority. Adoptive authority is when a program has been configured to use the owning profiles authority when it's being executed. This can allow a process to be granted additional authorities than what the process has at the beginning. So you can think of using this for enabling user profiles, resetting passwords, without having to grant all object and sec admin authorities to a user that might be responsible for changing those statuses of user profiles. You could instead have a program that they would be able to call that would simply do this for them, and now you do not have to make all of those users administrators of your system. So looking at a program, you would look at what the user profile is. By default, it will be star user. If it's adopting the owner's authority, it will be star owner. If the use adopted authority is also star yes, this means that that program can adopt authority from anywhere higher in the call stack. So that if there's a program higher in the call stack that's already adopted elevated authority, and now this program's going to execute something that requires that authority, it will have enough authority to complete that task. So if we take a deeper look at what that authorization list might look like, so that we can control objects at a more broad level. So we aren't having to secure individually thousands of objects, but rather we can group like objects together, have them secured by an authorization list, and now through that authorization list, we're able to grant authorities to that group of objects by making one simple change. So in this example I have on the screen, I'm using a single authorization list to secure 3 different files. I have my public authority referencing that authorization list for the public authority. And that's really important. I see often that we'll have an authorization list on objects, but public will have been set to change. But on the authorization list, public is set to exclude. The way that the system will look at that authority, if you don't have private authority, it's going to look at public on that object first, and that's change. And now you've been granted change. it's never going to see that public is excluded on that authorization list. So make sure if you are using authorization lists on your objects that you are setting public to reference that authorization list. So if we compare using authorization lists to control object authority versus group profiles, and I would say you can also use these in a combination together. But authorization lists are going to associate like objects and secure them, where group profiles are associating like profiles. The authorization list is going to secure multiple objects, just like we saw in that example where we had those 3 files being secured by one authorization list. But an object can only have one authorization list. A group can be authorized to multiple objects, so you can grant private authorities even to a group profile. And users can be members up to 16 groups. And it's all cumulative. So it really depends on how you are performing your identity management processes, how you're bringing users into your environment, and how you're securing those objects so you ensure that when you create that user profile and you add it to those groups, that you're only allowing them access to the objects you think you are. So this last pillar, this last critical piece is user profiles. And this is probably one of the harder pieces that we take for granted very often. Those user profiles are objects. They're an object type star user profile. Everything is an object type, and you can find it in the IBM I when you do a work object. The special pieces about user profiles is it not only allows them to authenticate to the system and work within your applications, but it defines the capabilities they have within your system's environment. So there are 8 different special authorities, and we're going to talk about those later. And each of them grant specific resource actions and permissions that your users can do. There are a number of supplied profiles that, other than ensuring that those passwords are set to none for those profiles, except for QSEC offer, really should go untouched. They are there for a reason. IBM has shipped them with the system, and they do have specific purposes to perform. The parameters I would like you to focus on and try and take a look at across your user community is the password expiration interval, because that can be overridden from your system values. The displaying of sign-on information, and this will allow your users to know, hey, did you sign on 15 minutes ago? Because if you didn't, there might be some bad activity happening and you should report it. I talked about the limit device session because that, again, can be overridden at the user profile level from what the system value is set to. And then block password change. This one ensures that the user themselves are not able to change their passwords within a certain number of hours. So this doesn't prevent security administrators, system administrators from being able to change those passwords, but it does prevent your users from changing those passwords over and over again before the time has passed that you've set in that block password change. Each of these values, I would say, adds to that security of how your users authenticate. So it works together with those system values, how you've configured your user profiles. Let's address one of the most important configurations on a user profile, and that's the special authorities that are being granted. All object allows access to every object on the system. With all object, you can also elevate your profile to have all of the other special authorities. I'm not going to tell you how in this, but know that that is a risk to having all object and all object only. The other special authorities do allow you to do other operations that all object alone does not. So star audit, that allows user profiles to stop auditing not only on individual objects, but also on the system itself. That's the security logging on the IBM I. Not very many users should have access to be able to change that configuration. IOsysconfig, not only does it allow for communications configuration and object communication, but it also allows you to configure shares. Job control, that allows access to manage any job on the system, any subsystem on the system. So with job control, you can run jobs out of the job scheduler, change jobs on the job scheduler, end any job that is actively running on the system. Save sys, this is a unique one where it actually can allow for the exfiltration of data. Because with save sys, you can save any object on the system, whether you have authority to it or not. And then you can take that object off the system, restore it to another system, and now everything you've restored, you likely are going to have access to. SecAdmin, that's about user profiles. SecAdmin is going to allow you to change those user profiles, not only their authorities, but their status and their capabilities. Star Service, this allows you to get into the lower levels of IBM I. It allows you to use service tools and do low-level traces and debugs. This should also be a very limited special authority. Spool control, which is probably one of the most widely granted authorities out there, grants access to every spooled file on your system, regardless if the user has access to the out queue or not. If they know what that out queue is, they can specify it and they will have access to all of those spooled files. So if you have financial data, if you have personnel data, HR data being printed into spooled files, think about who you're actually giving spool control to. When we define a powerful user, and I would say that many places have different ways of defining what a powerful user is. Some, if there is a single special authority, even spool control on a user profile, that profile is a powerful profile because it does have special authorities granted to it that allows it to access things that a user with no special authorities can't access. It could be a user that has private authorities to either another user profile or to specific objects. There are servers. We talked about the qcreate-auth system value. With that being set to star change and all of your objects being created with public star change, that could be considered permissive public authority because public is everyone, right? Public includes any and all of your user profiles on the system. So if you have granted every user in your system change authority to all of your data files, that could be considered pretty permissive authority being granted. And then the last is the way to execute commands. So there are certain commands that are going to be shipped with your system that allow even a user with limited capabilities, meaning that they have no command line access, to be able to execute a command. So the sign-off command, work message command, display message command, those are shipped with limited capability user yes. If there are other commands that have been changed to limit capability user yes, you may want to investigate if those commands truly should be available to users that do not have command line access or do not have limited capabilities. The first steps with user profiles is always setting up those templated users, identifying what those common pieces are that you want your user profiles to be secured by. whether that's an initial program, specific out queues, specific job Ds. Make sure that you create those templates so that you can standardize how your user profiles are being created in your system. Ensure that only those users that you intend to have creating user profiles have that ability to create user profiles. Monitor what user profiles are getting created on your system. I have found often that user profiles are getting created and the system administrators didn't even realize that others were able to do that because they didn't think that somebody would figure it out. We're no longer in that world where we can rely on, they'll never figure that out. The world we live in today it's at everyone's fingertips how to do just about everything, and especially our administrative roles. So using a programmatic approach to create user profiles and restricting that sec admin authority even further is really important. Looking at the audit profile creation for security events. So ensuring you have the audit journal even configured, that you have auditing turned on, that you're logging any possible security events, whether it is an authority failure or an invalid sign-on attempt. Some user profile parameters. If it is a group profile, certainly setting that profile to disabled is important. If it's a group profile, set that initial menu to star sign-off and the initial program to none. You want to make sure that profiles that are not related to another human being should not be able to authenticate to your system and act as if they were. And again, I'm reiterating that max sign-on and that max sign-on action are your friends to help you ensure that users that were issued those credentials are the only users using those credentials. So let's talk a minute about special authorities and group profiles. I mentioned earlier that a user can be a member of up to 16 group profiles. There's a primary profile and there's 15 supplementals. If each of those supplemental groups and the primary group have one of those 8 special authorities that I've talked about, cumulatively, a user that is a member of all of those groups will have all 8 special authorities and be an administrator of your system. It is really important to know how you are issuing those special authorities, what groups have those special authorities, and remember that they are cumulative. So if you grant spool control to one group and job control to another group, and then you add a user to both of those groups, they now have both of those special authorities. Often using programs to temporarily elevate users into a certain process, or even handing a process off to a batch process where you can elevate that program to a more powerful user, is a great way to segregate those authorities, segregate those duties, and be able to track who is doing what, because they can't just use those native commands. They have to go through your program. I've talked about limited capabilities a little bit, but it's something really important to remember is that it only counts in green screen. That limited capability setting is ignored in almost all of the interfaces coming in from the outside. ODBC, that SQL interface, when you're running remote commands, when you're making those connections, limited capabilities is not taken into consideration at all. So if they have access to that command, they can execute that command through that remote interface. It's still an important parameter to pay attention to because a lot of our applications are still on the green screen. So when you think that, oh, they just do work query and I don't have to worry about it, you should absolutely be paying attention to how they're using that command line. And if they only need one or two options, creating a quick menu is a better way to go. Removing that limited capability so they don't have the ability for the prompting and all of the additional helpful tools that IBM provides to somebody with command line access can help you protect your system from somebody finding something that you don't intend them to, or from somebody running something that they shouldn't have access to. When you do limit that command line access, I'm just going to reiterate that it's only good on that green screen, and that you need to pay attention if you have a lot of Excel macros, if people are downloading data, they can run remote commands through those options. Now, a few other things I want to touch on before we walk away, if I have not beat this drum enough yet. Don't give all object to a programmer, no matter how much they tell you they absolutely have to have it. Now, it might be painful at first, and it's going to take some work if you haven't done any work on how your objects are secured to ensure that they have enough access to do the job that you've hired them to do. But I promise you, you can have an environment where a programmer can be very successful developing for you without needing to be a system administrator as well. There's additional auditing that you might want to take a look at for those users that you've granted limited capabilities to. So if they have command line access, if they are able to run those commands directly, turning command auditing on to those user profiles is an important step. And certainly consider not making your help desk or your service desk users your administrators. Creating a program that they can call that will do in change of status on a user profile is a much better way for you to be able to ensure only those users that should be changing the status of a user are doing that, and limiting the amount of powerful profiles that you have configured on your system. So where do you get started? We've talked about a lot today. Truly assessing your security posture and where your system sits is a great place to start. So we do have an offer of a free security scan. This runs in less than 5 minutes. It will give you a high-level report on 7 different areas that you can pay attention to that will quickly allow you to get your system to a more secure posture. And lastly, for more resources, I want to mention that we have our IBM I Marketplace survey each year and our State of IBM I Security study. Both of these have valuable information about the IBM I community, where we see IBM I configurations moving, and what trends we've been able to observe over the last year and longer. So we talk about the things about the security level of systems. How many limited capability users are out there? How many percent of users have all object on systems that we're out there? All these observations hopefully can allow you to realize that you're not alone. Everybody's working towards this. And I would say the most exciting part to this coming year is the fact that everybody's paying more attention and all of our systems are getting more secure, and that can only make for a more secure world. Thank you for attending today. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and don't hesitate to reach out with any questions.